Well, one of the joys of the Faraday courses in the summer over the last, now the fourth year, has been the presence of Professor Ernan McMullin, who has a lifetime of wisdom to offer us. He was Professor at philosophy and Director of the Program in History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Notre Dame. He was at Notre Dame for something like 50 years. He is extremely distinguished and has written enormously on the history and philosophy in relation to religious belief and the natural sciences. He's been a visiting fellow at various universities, Cape Town, Minnesota, UCLA, Princeton, Yale. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the International Academy of the History of Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He served as president of the 4 major philosophical associations in the United States. So it's a great privilege to introduce someone so distinguished. We're very grateful to have you again, Ernan.
I had been asked to talk about the theological implications of the fine-tuning, or if you like, the Anthropic principle. And it occurred to me that it might be a good idea to talk, first of all, about not the theological implications, but the theological presuppositions from the Christian side of this kind of enterprise. I'm going to talk about the notion of creation which is involved and which is central, of course, to the whole question of the theological implications here, because what is invoked on the theological side is the notion of God as a creator. And so I want to look at that. It's a familiar topic to most everybody here, and yet there are aspects of it that are not really quite so familiar, I think. I have contributed an article on this to a book that I would in advance recommend. That's always a great danger. It's a book called, it's to come out from Cambridge. It's actually supposed to be due any moment. It's called Creation and the God of Abraham. It's edited by Janet Soskis, whom many of you know here at Cambridge, and David Burrell, a former colleague of mine. But it's on the notion of creation, and in the Abrahamic tradition generally. I'm going to talk about it only in the Christian tradition, which is already complicated enough. Now, the notion, what I will be stressing in this are the 2 elements that I think are important to the later issue in cosmology. One is the idea of creation ex nihilo, from nothing. That itself is a rather troubling phrase, because it sounds as though there's a ghostly substance called nothing, out of which God made the universe. The phrase itself in some ways is a bit unfortunate, because it does lead to misunderstanding. What's meant by it is that God makes from no previous materials. There are no material. It's not a human form of making which requires something to work on. It's a different kind of making. It's a making where nothing precedes it. There's no earlier precondition. Now, that's one thing I want to stress. And the other is the emphasis on creation in the Christian tradition as the creation of being. Now, that's going to be a little more complicated in one way, at least anyway, the creation of existence. And existence is the problematic element which has to be taken care of, so to speak. Now, I'm going to begin with the Old Testament, and you'll be hearing much more of this, of course, from Dr. Lucas tomorrow. He is one of the great authorities on the Old Testament, and specifically on the book of Genesis. So what I have to say here will simply be a preliminary to what he will be talking about tomorrow. So the chapters with which the Bible opens could easily give the impression that cosmogony, the making of the world, the question of cosmic origins, was of major concern from the beginning to the writers of the Old Testament. But this, of course, was far from being the case. The 2 creation chapters, as I think came up the other evening, on Monday evening, date from quite different periods. The 2nd chapter, of course, is much the older. It probably dates back to the 10th century BC, to the time even possibly of David. It's a very ancient document, and in it, the creation of man comes before the creation of the plant and animal world. But the focus of it is clearly really awaiting. The focus is the whole role of man. The Garden of Eden and the fall and the expulsion from the garden are all about the nature of the human, what the role of the human is, what its relationship is with the divine, and of course specifically with the notion of sin. Now, God is a constant presence in the later works of the Old Testament, the early works of the Old Testament, the covenant with Abraham, the escape from Egypt, the entry into Canaan, and the reign of David, of course. But God appears there not so much as a cosmic creator, but as a devoted protector of the people of Israel. He had those people whom he had chosen as his own, a people who had to be forcibly reminded quite often of what the covenant with God really involved for them, and especially what obligations it imposed on them. The narrative centers on that relationship between God and Israel. That is what mattered above all else at that point. So long as his powers were sufficient for the many great acts that marked his guardianship of Israel, that was sufficient. But in some even of the earliest Psalms, the theme of creation makes a dramatic appearance in language that for many scholars has suggested some degree of Canaanite influence, but it's marvelous language, and it's familiar to most here, I suppose. How great your name throughout the earth, above the heavens is your majesty chanted. I look up at the heavens made by your fingers, at the moon and the stars that you set in place. What is man that you should spare a thought for him? The heavens declare the glory of God. The vault of heaven proclaims his handiwork. Some of the greatest language of all time, I should think. This is not, in these verses, this is not the God of a small desert people. One God among many in a region where every tribe worshipped its own pantheon. This is no pantheon, but a unique being who lays claim to heavens and earth, the power of cosmic creation that sets him apart from all others. Only such a being could have brought about the wonders that marked off the history of Israel. Only such a being could have spoken to Moses as he did from the burning bush or from the heights of Sinai. His name and no other should go out to all the earth. But a tension is already beginning to show itself here between what many scholars have called the inside and the outside theology of Israel. On the one hand, there is the particularity of the calling of Israel, a single small people. The overthrow of Israel's foes, the promise to Israel of the lands of others, a rather troubling thing for us to think about today. God is above all, it would seem, Israel's God. But on the other hand, there is the implicit universality of the creation theme itself. God is the God of all the earth, it seems, of all the nations, the God to whom not just Israel, but all owe homage, the God who cares for all his creatures. Should Israel then share God with the other nations? How is Israel to retain its favored status as the nation dearest to Yahweh or God, using the more usual phrase, than all others? Now that tension continues to haunt the later works of the Old Testament also. The trauma much later, 400 or 500 years later, of the exile in the 6th century, the Babylonian exile, that called for reassurance on the part of the Israelites that God had not forsaken them entirely. Surely this chaos, the chaos of that time, should not prevail. It's from this period that the great first chapter of Genesis dates, so it would seem. The literature of Babylon itself might have influenced some elements in its composition, that's a matter of much discussion. But the theologians of the exile and the post-exilic Israel could reflect on their own traditions and ask how God's people should tell their own story of cosmic origins, one in which God would play a role more in keeping with the mysterious phrase, "I am who am," of the response long before to Moses' query. The emphasis of the six-day narrative is above all on God's role in the establishment of order, that for which the people in Babylon so longed, order in the world. The overcoming of darkness and of the chaos of the primal waters, the making fertile of the earth, the making of sun and moon, note, not as gods, but as simply a means of ordering time. This a rebuke to the others of that area who had a very different view of sun and moon. God fills in the seas and the land with living kinds, and finally, the making of humans after God's own image. There's no hint in all this of any limit to God's power or any defect in the world that he has brought about. Rather, at each step, God surveys his handiwork and sees, and this is the crucial phrase, sees that it is good. His people must not then despair. Their God has overcome chaos before and can be counted on once again, this time to overcome the lesser chaos of captivity. The old Latin translation used in the Christian church in the earliest days, or early days, the old Latin translation of that famous opening verse, perhaps reflecting the conviction of a later time, a much later time, ran as in the familiar words, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void." Not surprisingly, this was taken in the early church to affirm that God's act of creation was ex nihilo, from nothing, that there was nothing before heavens and earth other than the Creator himself. And the retention of that version in the long authoritative Vulgate tradition, particularly among Catholics, the Vulgate translation held authority for many centuries, that strengthened that impression. But exegetical opinion today, both among Christians and incidentally among Jews, would have a significantly different translation as the correct one. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless wasteland, and darkness covered the abyss while a mighty wind swept over the waters. The waters were apparently there already. There is no mention of them having been created. It was from them, through God's creative action, that the heavens and the earth seem to have emerged. On the second day, a vault was created to divide those waters, when the waters seem to be represented as a separate pre-existing entity. There is much, you will hear more about that from Dr. Lucas, I imagine. Still, the phrase, let there be light, let there be a vault, let there be the lights in the vault of heaven. These phrases could certainly be understood as summoning into existence rather than fashioning from something pre-existent. On the other hand, the creative acts of the remaining days do mention the materials out of which the creative world appears. Quote, let the dry land appear from the waters, unquote. Let the waters teem, unquote. Let the earth produce, unquote. It seems fair to say that the evidence for creation ex nihilo in these chapters is at best ambiguous. There are hints here of the doctrine, but it will take a later generation to develop those hints further when the ex nihilo character of creation for the first time will become an issue. I could mention many other passages. I'll be a little brief here. The most emphatic statement, I think, in the entire Old Testament of God's creative powers comes in Job's accusations, the famous accusations that Job lays against the Creator. I'm sorry, God's response to Job's accusations. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me, since you are so well informed, who decided the dimensions of it? Do you know? Who penned up the sea behind closed doors? Come thus far, I said, And no further, here your proud wave shall break. Have you ever given orders to the morning, or sent the sun down to its post? Can you fasten the harness of the Pleiades, or untie Orion's bonds? Can you guide the morning star season by season, and show the bear and its cubs where to go? Have you grasped the celestial laws? Could you make their writ run on the earth? Unquote. Attributing this statement to God himself heightens the solemnity of the affirmation it makes. By this time, the celebration of God's universal claim had become far more pronounced than it had been in the days of the patriarchs. There had been ample time to reflect on the implication of God's role in Israel's own history, what it portended to the dignity of their Lord. Prodded, no doubt, by their interactions with the nations whose histories had so long been entangled with theirs, the representatives of the people of Israel had to make it quite clear that God was not to be compared with the gods of the other nations. God dwelt on a quite other plane, the single creator of all that is, claiming sovereignty over all the nations, the only God, the only true God. There is an explicit reference to ex nihilo creation, a famous one in a very late book of the Old Testament, a book that has not been accepted by all, the Second Maccabees, where a tormented mother addresses her remaining son and says, "Observe heaven and earth, consider all that is in them, and acknowledge that God made them out of what did not exist." That's the only explicit passage in the Old Testament about nihil. As it stands, this does seem, of course, like creation ex nihilo, but there is some doubt as to how that phrase should be taken. Again, this is a matter for the exegetes. And also as to whether, on the authority of that phrase alone, one could say that the understanding in Israel at that point of Yahweh's creative act had moved that crucial step further. I haven't mentioned the New Testament. There is little to say there about cosmology, about cosmic issues. But the work of creation in Genesis had, in that, of course, God had clearly made use of existing materials like the eliciting of the first vegetation from the earth, or the molding of the first human body from the dust, all making from something or other else. Whether others of the Creator's actions in setting in place the beginning world had in fact been strictly ex nihilo, with nothing previous, was a question that had simply not yet called for an explicit answer. It wasn't that was denied or anything, it simply hadn't quite apparently come up. But that time would very soon come. And so we moved to a different world. The theologians of the early Christian church faced a challenge that the biblical writers had never known. The religion of Israel had not been a missionary one. There was no incentive to make it intellectually acceptable to potential converts. Nor had there been a wider intellectual culture in possession in whose terms the religious thinkers of Israel might have been led to express the tenets of their faith. Matters would be very different for the heralds of the new Christian faith. To begin with, theirs was an essentially missionary undertaking. But the Roman world in which they were beginning to make their way was informed by a new cultural phenomenon, one that the Israelites had not faced, at least not earlier. These were philosophical worldviews of Greek origin that claimed to rest on reason and on argument rather than on tradition. Again, something rather new. In this new situation, creeds would have to develop into theologies. Indeed, one might almost say that it was this situation itself, that theology itself as an enterprise was born. Among the Greek philosophical systems, two in particular had taken root in the Roman world. The first, of course, was Platonism. It appealed to the Romans because of the literary attraction of its expression and the coherence and persuasiveness of the worldview it presented. What matters, of course, to us here is the question of cosmogony. In the Timaeus, Plato presents an account of how the world came to be in the form of a myth or a likely story. And without developing that further, that is going to make some suggestions for the early Christians. The other philosophical system was Stoicism. Now that, though Greek in origin, flourished most especially in the Rome of the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Rome to which the Christians came was largely, or at least in a great measure, influenced by Stoic thought. For the Stoics, only bodies exist. They are constituted by two principles: a matter principle, which is inert, and a God who is immanent in the world itself and acts as a fire, an intelligence. All things for them began in a fire which contains, and here is the phrase that I mentioned the other evening, contains the seeds of all that will come later. There was much about these philosophies that Christians could Christians could comfortably relate. Above all, their adherents had turned away from the extended pantheon of the older Roman tradition to assert the primacy of a single God, supreme and all-shaping. But for Platonists and Stoics alike, and this was the crucial point, there was a second principle over against God, not of God's making, and apparently even resistant to some extent to God's action. Now, how was this to be reconciled with the God of the biblical tradition? This was a question that was bound to arise at some point for those Christians of the 2nd and 3rd century who took the contribution of philosophy to worldview very seriously. They had to. Gerhard May, who has written a great deal about this, puts it in this way: what led finally to the making explicit of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo was, he says, quote, the attempt to do justice to the absolute sovereignty and unlimited freedom of the biblical God acting in history over against the alternatives offered by Stoicism and Platonism. Besides the impetus given by the Greek philosophical systems, there was one other development, perhaps even more important, in the Roman world in the 2nd century that also forced Christians to clarify what they meant by saying God created the world. This was the growth of Gnosticism, which is generally said to have had an Eastern origin, although that's not entirely clear. The Gnostics viewed the material world in overwhelmingly negative terms. It was something to be escaped from in one way or another. It could not, therefore, be the work of the supreme God. Most Gnostic theologians attributed the origin of the material world to lesser beings, who, though themselves of God's making, were inimical to him. Some, however, saw matter as a primal darkness, a chaos over which God had only very limited sway in bringing the world to be. Gnosticism posed a direct challenge to the Christians who were trying to define themselves in this new and turbulent context. Yet it also attracted many of them by its call to asceticism and its rejection of the clearly ungodly features of the everyday world of Rome of that day. Some prominent Gnostic theologians, Basilides and Valentinus, for example, regarded themselves as better informed Christians. They thought of themselves as Christians, except, of course, with a strong Gnostic component. One of them, indeed, famously, Marcion, went much further. He says, one must look to Christ for salvation, but the God whom Christ preached was not the same as the God of the Old Testament. The demiurge, as he calls it, identified with the Platonic demiurge, which was responsible for a defective, ultimately evil world. The good God has created an invisible world to which the true followers of Christ must aspire. Basilides, one of these Gnostics, happens, oddly enough, to be the first who gives the first completely explicit formulation of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, at least that has come down to us. Unlike his fellow Gnostics, he portrays God as the creator of all that is. He is explicit, there is no coexistent or defective matter over against him. God is so far beyond human ways of making that he does not require a pre-existent material that limits the product that he is creating. And so the creation has to be ex nihilo. It's very interesting because in that sense Basilides of course departs from Gnosticism, so he is halfway to a very different view already. But it was really only in the second half of the 2nd century that Christians began to separate themselves sharply from this Gnostic view, which would set God only imperfectly as maker of the world, with a powerful Star Wars type of conflict going on. The clamour in Rome of competing religious proclamations grew louder at this point. Reconstructing the variety of different readings from that time is very difficult because of the fragmentary character of the survival of manuscript material. The Gnostic cosmogonies admitted ever more imaginative elaboration, more attractive to the people of the day. The Gnostic cosmogonies had in common an uncompromising dualism between the nature, between the matter-bound, the dark powers, and the immaterial realities associated with the highest God. And the Neoplatonists promoted their own dualist version by emphasizing the imperfections of the matter with which the demiurge had to cope. Tatian, a pupil of Justin Martyr had not been on the side of ex nihilo. Tatian recognized the tension between this notion of an ungenerated matter and the biblical conception of an all-powerful creator, as Justin had perhaps prepared him to see. He asserted that matter also was created by God, who is the only ungenerated principle, breaking definitively in that way with the Greek philosophical tradition. It was left to a writer around the beginning of the 3rd century, Theophilus of Antioch. He, as far as we know, is the first to have proclaimed creation ex nihilo in the full sense, specifically within the Christian tradition, and he argued for it in considerable detail. Were matter to be ungenerated, he says, it too would be godlike. It would be over against God. God's overlordship in respect to all that it would would be compromised, and his creative action would not differ from that of a human craftsman. Only by recognizing the creation to have been ex nihilo is the supremacy of the divine will to be given full expression, and only thus can justice be done to the testimony of the Scriptures. The evidence here is the evidence of the Scriptures for Theophilus, that the God presented in the Old Testament is clearly not to be limited in the way in which the Gnostics limited them. So that to sum up then on this, for the creation ex nihilo doctrine in the first place, the Scriptures rather than specific philosophic argument were the source. In the face of various worldviews that took the evident presence in the world of evils of all sorts as premise for a dualism that set limits on God's creative power, the theologians of the early church, beginning late 2nd but especially early 3rd century, gradually came to realize that implicit in the Scriptures to which they were devoted lay a rejection of any such limits. Relying primarily on those Scriptures, they formulated a doctrine of the Creator as all-powerful, and in consequence they rejected the view that over against them there had been from the beginning an ungenerated principle that was not fully under his sway, or lesser beings that were responsible for the multiple imperfections of the world. Now with that, of course, we have then the familiar doctrine ex nihilo that we have today. It was developed much more fully by writers like Tertullian, Origen, and others in the 3rd and 4th centuries, but by that time the doctrine itself was clear. There's one remaining issue to stress. When we come to Augustine, I could spend too much time on that, so I'll be very brief on this. We already talked about that on Monday night a little. When we come to Augustine, Augustine, of course, began as a Neoplatonist, or he didn't, he began really as a Manichaean, alas, but he was, by the time of his return to Christian belief, he was very much influenced by Neoplatonism. And in the form of Neoplatonism that he was keen on, that is the work of Plotinus, there is a very heavy emphasis on the one, on the one which is good, which is absolute, which is all, in some sense, the source of all other being. Now, Plotinus does not believe in creation ex nihilo, because over the one, so to speak, emanates from himself lesser beings, in a kind of a progression downwards, and in the end it descends to the level of a matter which he describes as non-being, which is kind of paradoxical, which is over against the one. So there is already a dualism there. Augustine wants to overcome that, and he wants to overcome it most specifically because his former colleagues, the Manichaeans, of course, one of their central doctrines was the struggle between the forces of good and evil, which was almost equally balanced, it would seem. And so to overcome the Manichaean tradition, it was utterly crucial for him that God not be limited by the material of a pre-existent world, of a pre-existent nature, which would limit his power and be the source of all evil. And so he formulates this famous doctrine, which of creation ex nihilo, where God brings all to be. We've heard this already several times. He brings to be a space-time. It's interesting that he puts together space and time in ways that have later echoes. And it's not a matter of God creating space. He's not a deist. It's important to see that. It's not that God creates a space and then lets it go on. That would have made no sense for Augustine. He creates space and time together, and so creation and conservation, holding us in being at this very moment, is part of the original act of creation. It's not a kind of a continuous act on God's part to keep things from falling apart. It's simply part of the original act. The division between creation and conservation is from our point of view, not of course from God's point of view. Now, one of the things that he stresses very strongly is, and has much to say about this philosophically, is that, and this turns out to be a rather crucial issue today, actually, on the issues we're going to be hearing about in a moment, and that is, he argues that existence itself requires a cause, requires a reason or a cause. That is to say, creation is a creation of being. It's not a creation of form as it was for the Platonists. It's not a creation of motion or a continuation of motion as it was for Aristotle. It's not simply form and motion. It's being itself that requires the God's creative act. That, of course, was a very unfamiliar notion if you go further back, because in the Greek tradition there is no trace of that view as far as I know. And I think for the Greeks, who were so conscious of the tragic element of life, the whole idea of making God responsible for all would have seemed unthinkable, I think. Certainly Plato did not have that, and of course Aristotle does not have a creator of any kind. But so at any rate, he wishes to emphasize then that as we look at being, the first product of the Creator is to bring being itself, that is to make existent, make alive a universe which formerly did not exist. So being is at the center of this act, and much later, when Aquinas comes to meditate on these same issues, Aquinas goes much further than Aristotle, than Augustine, by creating an entire metaphysics of being. Thomas in the modern times have made much of the notion of being in Aquinas, of existence, as it were the first act, that what God is related to is, what God is responsible for is that there should be, as the phrase goes, something rather than nothing actually. That doesn't quite apply in the same way here, because of course God is already existent, but the point is that the state of existence requires a cause. So I'm going to leave it at that, because we have here, and the point of all this is that there is this developed doctrine in the early church, a very detailed doctrine of creation, which was slow in coming in a sense. It was a fruit of much reflection on the part of the centuries, on the part of the Hebrew people, and later of Christians, faced by a question which the Hebrews had not faced, and that is, what do we do about those who hold that God is not responsible for all, that there is some sort of conflict within the world between equal forces, or at least almost equal forces. And so the Christians in these centuries make an option, reflecting on their relationship with the Creator, reflecting on many issues of their prayer life, come to the conclusion that what we have must be a creation ex nihilo of existence itself. Okay, that's part one. Now, Rodney has covered in great detail a lot of topics having to do with the anthropic principle and so on, with fine-tuning and with the consequences of it. I'm going to try to focus on some issues that haven't come up. Unfortunately, I will have to repeat. I mean, since I was asked to talk about the theological implications, inevitably I have to go back on some of the things that have already been said. But there are a few things that I want to try to make clear. I want to give a little history here, but there's one thing in particular that you're going to be hearing later in our program here. You're going to be hearing several talks that talk about anthropic principle. The anthropic principle in biology, for example. Now, I am quite skeptical about that, as I may have a chance to say later on. I'm very doubtful that there is an anthropic principle in biology, but much worse than that, I'm not even sure that there's an anthropic principle. At least let me make that clear. I'll have to try to lay that out. But what I want to get clear here, and I think it's quite important, is what the relationship is between the so-called anthropic principle and the notion of fine-tuning. Those are the two phrases you hear a lot about here. What's the relationship between them? In order to explain that, let me go back a little bit. Already in the, let's see, where should I start? In the 1960s, a physicist, Robert Dicke, a very eminent physicist at Princeton, was discussing an issue that Dirac had raised, and actually Eddington had raised long before. And I don't have time really to go into the Dirac problem, but what Dicke does is to introduce the notion that when one is discussing the nature of the cosmos, it may be important to note a selection effect. Now, what's a selection effect here? Let me give you a simple example, the one that inevitably is always given. Namely, if fishermen go out to fish, when they come back, they notice they have no fish smaller than, say, half an inch. What happened to all the small fish? Well, then somebody points out that's the mesh of the net. So what has happened here, that the catch, the nature of the catch, is dependent on the selection, on the constraints set on the selection. That is to say, when we look at the product of the fishing here, what's peculiar about it, it might seem that there aren't any small ones, is produced by the methods, in fact, in which the fishing was done. So it's called this, it's not a real effect. It's not as though there are no small fish. It's a selection effect. It's selected out. That's an initial point. Now, Dicke was talking about that, and in the context of a problem raised by Dirac, and what he says, what he does is to say that we are as human beings, we are at a certain stage of universe development. That is to say, life like ours, complex life like ours, could not have existed in the very early universe. The materials would not have been there. They could not exist in the very late universe, because in fact by that time there will be heat death and so on. In other words, the stars will have burnt out. And so we only exist in this set of time. And he asks himself, does that create a selection effect? In other words, does that bias, does that limit our take on the cosmos? And he argues that Dirac falls into that trap. Again, I no need to work that out since it doesn't really affect much what happens later. But it's interesting that that's the first time that an anthropic explanation is introduced. Now, what's an anthropic explanation? An anthropic explanation in science, or elsewhere, is one which introduces human beings either as agents or their very presence as a constraining element. That is, it's something you have to take into account when you're working out this particular problem. In other words, it's a kind of reminder, take into account the presence of the observer himself and others like him, take into account the fact that that you as human beings are already there. You're in a privileged time at which it's not a privileged space, but it's a privileged time at which humans can exist, but there are many other times when they can't. So that is at least an early origin. Now, when you come in the 1970s to the birth of the so-called anthropic principle itself, what happens is this, that when Hawking and Collins look at the problem that was such a big problem at that time, which is the energy density of the universe, the energy density, or some would say mass energy density, but I think energy density is the correct phrase here, the energy density of the universe, on which the expansion or contraction of the universe depends, according to relativity theory. It turns out, and Hawking was utterly astonished by this, it turns out that to have a universe that is as closely balanced between expansion and contraction as we do have, it is almost extraordinarily unlikely in the sense that it has to be set to an almost incredible degree. He talks in terms of 10 to the power of 50 or something like that in terms of percentage. But at any rate, the point is that we have a boundary condition, a first condition of the universe, of the state of the universe, which seems to say that for this energy density to be the case would require, and here we have for the first time the notion of fine-tuning. Now, that phrase itself, that is that this, notice the nature of this argument. In order to have something else, namely life in the universe, you have to have the universe fine-tuned in the sense that the boundary conditions, the cosmic energy density has to be of a very, very precise nature. Now, that notion of fine-tuning then required, in order to talk about fine-tuning, you really have to have features of the universe that are constrained to very narrow, unexpectedly, that notion of unexpected here is tricky, but unexpectedly narrow bounds. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, Hawking was very disturbed by that. And Hawking, not particularly enthusiastic about theological alternatives, he and his co-worker Collins suggested as an alternative that there would be one way in which it could be converted into a selection effect. And that would be the following. Supposing one had a multitude, I won't use the term, he used the term infinity, but hold on that one. A multitude of existing universes. Now that, as Rodney said earlier, is very important, not possible universes. Supposing there's a set of existing universes which have all kinds of alternative energy densities. Maybe only 1 in billions would be right for us. Well, of course, that's where we would be. No surprise. So there's no surprise then the selection effect shows that supposing you have a bunch of universes, real universes, with multiple cosmic densities, then to find ourselves in one which is fine-tuned is no longer surprising. Where else would we be? Obviously. So, but notice that that's the selection effect. What is happening here that we are selecting this universe because we're here. And that's why he called it anthropic. I'm sorry, it wasn't he who called it anthropic. Okay, but it was very shortly afterwards called anthropic. It's anthropic because it invokes the presence of the human as a means of explanation, as a source of the selection effect. Now, shortly after that, well, actually, going on for some time even before that, but especially after that, a very different kind of fine-tuning appeared. Because a number of physicists, even before that, had asked whether or not one might have something peculiar about the major constants of the universe, the relationship between the four fundamental forces and so on. The question is whether there's anything special about them. Now, here we have a rather different situation. There is a difference, although the nature of the difference is disputed, between talking about a boundary condition, that is the energy density of the universe, which seems as though it could have, multiple values. It doesn't seem to be any reason why it couldn't be different. But it's a different matter entirely if you talk about the constants of the universe. For example, the mass of the proton, or the relationship between, let's say, the electromagnetic and the gravitational force, or something like that. This seems this is law-like. It's what I call gnomic, N-O-M-I-C, because it's based on the laws of nature. And it's not entirely evident that one can talk about alternatives there. But at any rate, the issue of fine-tuning comes up again there. And but before I get to what the basis for that is, let me just say that there is here a very fundamental move. Just after the appearance of Hawking's work, Brandon Carter, who made his name by this article, introduces the notion of an anthropic principle. Okay, what's an anthropic principle? Well, for him, he mentioned two kinds of principle, a weak form of principle and a strong form. The strong form is either trivial or false, so let's leave that alone. But the weak form is a truism. And I'll put it in a different way than the way he put it. If X's exist, X's can be anything, beetles, bumblebees, humans. If X's exist in a universe, the theory of that universe has to take account of the existence of X's. That's not very exciting. That sounds like it could have been formulated by Aristotle, for example. That is to say, a theory of the universe has to take into account all that's in it, including whatever the X's are. That's very weak. It's so weak as to be rather obvious, to say the least. But the way in which he introduces it is in the context of the fine-tuning. Now, of course, if you use it in that context, then anthropic comes in here, because from the point of view of Hawking, it's crucial that it's the present. What he's trying to explain is the presence in our universe. I mean, what it is that makes our universe, the anthropic universe, what it is. And so, from Hawking's point of view, this is anthropic. He has a problem which is based on an anthropic issue. How come we're in the right kind of universe? His answer is to say, well, there are all these bunches of universes. Of course, we're in the one in which we can exist. Where else would we be? So he dissolves. He doesn't explain so much as explain away the peculiarity of the fact that we're here. So, in that sense, there isn't anything to explain for him. But what's crucial, where anthropic comes in here, is from the fact that the issue is shifted over to the Hawking issue. Now, because people have often remarked since that instead of talking about an anthropic principle, you could talk about a beetle principle. You know, and the conditions for existence of beetles are the same as for us in terms of the nature of the universe. But in fact, the point is that there is a special problem involving the presence of the human that causes us to speak of anthropic. Now, my suggestion here, long-time suggestion, is that we should not speak of an anthropic principle. It simply leads to all kinds of misunderstandings. But what we can speak of and should speak of is anthropic explanations. That is, explanations which invoke the presence or agency of the human. There are plenty of those. Climate warming, that's an anthropic issue. What we say is that climate warming has an anthropic explanation. Now, you don't hear that phrase, but that's exactly what anthropic means. That it is an agency of the human which is responsible, or at least partially responsible for it. Okay, so anthropic explanation is quite common in science from that point of view. When we invoke human agency to explain some feature of the world as it is. So now, let's see, how far along am I?
About 5 minutes, so I mean, you can stretch it a bit longer.
Okay, well, yeah. So I wanted to get that clear because I think it's quite important. So let's get clear what an anthropic explanation is and completely forget about anthropic principles, repress them, because there aren't. They're either trivial or there aren't any, depending on what your choice is. Now, when we come very rapidly to the end of the story, there are a lot of developments here that are rather crucial. Some of them mentioned already. The main focus of the fine-tuning argument shifted away from the cosmic energy density, which was where it started. That was to some extent taken care of by the inflation model, which came in the early 80s from Alan Guth. But really, it doesn't have, for other reasons, it doesn't have the force it originally had. But what is absolutely crucial is that there are these other features of the universe, the gnomic ones. I just mentioned a few so that we know what we have in mind here. If the electromagnetic force were to be even slightly stronger relative to the other forces, all stars would be red dwarfs, and planets would never form, and planets are probably necessary for life, although that's debated. If it were a little weaker, all stars would be very hot and thus short-lived. Other thought experiments bear on the chemical constitution of the imagined universe. If a strong nuclear force were to be just a little stronger, all of the hydrogen in the early universe would have been converted to helium, and so on. There's quite a lot of those. There's quite a lot. So it seems as though that the constants that define our universe in a very general way seem to be both fine-tuned. Now, there have been a number of developments. For example, the one mentioned by Rodney, which was involving well, it turns out very recently, and our guest here from the Islamic world knows this very well, it turns out that within the last 10 years, to great surprise, it turns out that the universe, which which has been expanding, of course, since the Big Bang, is beginning to speed up. It apparently started to speed up about 7 billion years ago. And so there is a speeding up involved. It's a complicated issue, but there's a speeding up. Now, what has been invoked to explain that is a form of dark energy. Dark energy is loosely associated and confusingly associated with something called the cosmological constant. What do I want to say here? The
Quantum vacuum, the
cosmological constant. Sorry. The cosmological constant is something quite different. The cosmological constant was on the left-hand side of the Friedel equations, to use a technical expression. So it's a feature of space. Whereas what was needed was something on the other side, an energy, which is not at all what Einstein had in mind. So there's, to call it, I mean, it's been very confusing. It's inserted the way that Einstein did, but it's the other side of the equation. It means something quite different. So at any rate, what we have here then is a very strange form of energy, which has greatly complicated the whole question of fine-tuning. I simply don't have time for that. But let me just come to complete to the end. Here we have a situation where the law-like features of our universe seem to be in some sense special in the context of the presence within the universe of ourselves. And not only ourselves, but planets, galaxies, complex chemicals, all of the rest of it, not just us. But of course it's of special interest to us, being us. So the question is what to make of that. Well, to just wrap it up as neatly as I can, there are really four possible explanations, or four possible approaches. Not all of them are explanations by any means. There are four possible, there are more. There's one by Edward Harrison, if anybody wants me to talk about it, but it's rather wild. But there are four main ones. And one is that it's simply a chance occurrence. So we come out of a house, we find that the registration number on a car happens to be our phone number. Should we be surprised? Well, it could happen by chance. It could happen by chance. And in principle, that cannot be excluded here, at least in my view. It cannot be excluded. A chance possibility is hard to, I mean, from the scientific standpoint, I'm talking scientifically now for the moment. From the scientific standpoint, it's difficult to refute the possibility that it could be a simply chance thing. But interestingly enough, scientists are very uneasy about that. I don't have time to talk about, which was mentioned by Rodney, the principle of indifference, but they're very, very uneasy about having to assume special features in either the laws or the initial conditions of the universe, because that seems to call for explanation from the scientific standpoint. So it's not a very popular view among scientists, actually. Now, a second one, which has more promise, although many would say not much, but it has to be taken into account. It's the old advice given by Galileo a long time ago in a different context, and that is to say, science is a developing feature, don't cut out the future, we don't quite know what will come next, and so don't take a position prematurely that could be refuted by a later scientific development. Now, the question then is going to be, how plausible would it be that all of these very numerous fine-tuning factors, that all of these could be simultaneously taken account of by a later theory? Again, it should be left open. And it should be left open in particular because we actually do know that a new theory is needed. I mean, that's a point that I think should be emphasized. That is to say, the two major theories of modern science, quantum theory and relativity theory, simply don't join successfully. The search for a unified field theory is many years ago. I have had the very good fortune to work under Schrödinger. And Schrödinger devoted the last part of his life fruitlessly to what he called unified field theory, which called theory of quantum gravity today. And since that time, which is all too many years ago, thousands of people have worked on this, and so far unsuccessfully. String theory, to my mind at least, no expert, I don't think it's going to be the solution, but who knows. At any rate, we do know that a drastic reordering of a kind that happened with both quantum theory and relativity theory is at least in the offing at some point. Some would say very soon, some would say not very soon. But at least we can't exclude that. But you see, what that would have to do would be to handle a great many, I mean, people have been counting these and they come up with different kinds, dozens, I would say, of these apparent coincidences that are required in order to produce a life-bearing universe, a biotic universe. So, but that's possible. One can't exclude that, I think. The other two explanations are the two that have been already discussed today. Now, what's interesting is both of them are anthropic. both are anthropic, and when people like Weinberg talk about the anthropic principle, I think it gets confused because it sounds as though an anthropic principle is only at the science form. The theological explanation is anthropic. The multiverse, or the many worldviews that was originally called, is also anthropic, but in a very different way. And so I'd end by pointing to that. That is to say, to start with the multiverse, we'll start with the many worldview. I think, in the light of some of the questions asked, I should make a distinction here. A many worldview, the terminology here is disputed, but a many worldview would be one where from an initial condition, from an initial state, multiple worlds are generated, but that are no longer in contact and never again will be in contact, but share a common origin. Now that's crucial. They share a common origin, a big bang of some kind, but they go off in different directions within a space, and within a space-time, the same space-time, but they're no longer in any kind of possible contact, primarily because of the velocity of light, although not just because of that. Okay, that would be a many worldview. A many universe view, which is more recent, is quite different, because there, I'll take the most plausible form, I think, of the many universe view, Lindy and Vilenkin. And that is where you have a theory which claims that there is, as it were, a superspace within which universes bubble up all the time. Now, these universes have never been in contact. That's why we call it many universe rather than many world. There is no initial causal contact between them, but they are part of a single superspace, which, at least as Lindy sees it, is infinite. Now, the theory that Lindy puts forward here is based on a great many assumptions. Among other things, he's using scalar fields, which are problematic, although they're used in the expansion, expansion view of Guth, the
inflation theory.
At any rate, they have been used in some other theory, but there is a problem about scalar fields. But at any rate, the point about the way in which Lindy defends himself is to say that there could be a single theory of this which would be instantiated in our universe and supported by its applicability to our universe, but nonetheless would require the existence of these other universes. So they are a consequence, and the point that he makes is, for what it's worth, is that it would be validated within our universe, but a consequence of that theory would be it would require there to be other universes of multiple kinds. Again, a huge assumption about these other universes. I mean, there's so many assumptions there. So that's the conventional scientific one at the moment. Weinberg, who is one of its strong supporters, I think is strongly influenced by it as being, for him, the only scientific alternative to a theological one, which gives him shivers, if you happen to know Weinberg. Weinberg is the American Dawkins. But at any rate, but Weinberg is a physicist, where Dawkins, of course, is a biologist. At any rate, so we have that as the scientific alternative for the moment. Then, of course, we come to the other anthropic explanation. The other anthropic explanation is, of course, the theological one. Now, the theological one has the advantage, a singular advantage, of simply calling on, you can call it a theory, a doctrine, and I use the neutral term doctrine, a doctrine which is already in place. The problem, in a sense, with the multiverse, at least one problem with the multiverse, is that what occasioned it, what led it to be postulated in the first place, was the fine-tuning. So it was originally, now mind you, Lindy tries to go beyond that, but at any rate, the original reason was the fine-tuning. But from the point of view of the theologian here, when he looks at fine-tuning, what he's going to say is, well, of course, if in fact the universe was to contain life, and if within the provisions of God, within the purposes of the Almighty, there were to be within that universe human beings with powers of freedom and of choice, the kind of things that would make in some way at least for an image of himself. If God, from the Christian standpoint, the Creator obviously has, as it were, part of the divine purposes of which we would have access to only a very limited corner, but at least we do have access through the Bible to a small corner. In that small corner, it is clear that the presence of the human was part of the divine purposes. Now, if that's the case, the Creator would, of course, create a universe within which the constraints would allow for the natural development within that universe of over the many aeons of complex life, including human life. So that from that point of view, what's the advantage that it has, obviously, is that it requires no new postulation. It simply is a consequence of an earlier strongly argued for account, but strongly argued for from a theological standpoint, not scientific. There's nothing scientific about that original account that is of God as a creator. So here we have a curious situation, because here we have the two competing anthropic explanations, one turning to science, one turning to theology and metaphysics. And it's a unique, that has never happened before, I think. In all of the long contacts between religion and science, I don't think anything of quite that sort has ever happened before. And one of the curious consequences of it is that it's extremely difficult to know what kind of criteria would be appropriate for a choice between them. We have no agreed joint criteria. We have criteria in theology, well developed over the ages. We have very well developed criteria in science, but there isn't, as it were, a super criteria, a set which allows us to adjudicate in cases of difference. It's interesting here that the two accounts are not strictly speaking in conflict, because in point of fact, if the multiverse theory is right, one still needs a reason to suppose that there is a multiverse of that very special kind. So there is need for a creator there. So the multiverse does not displace the possibility or the plausibility of the creation account. And so there is a rather curious set of relations here. I don't have time to develop that further. But what I want to end with is that we have a rather interesting and, in a sense, troubling situation, at least for the moment, and I think for some time to come, which is that we have two perfectly, well, I was going to say perfectly good. They're both, of course, contested, strongly contested for different reasons. But here we have two accounts of the fundamentals of the universe, which give very different accounts of a very fundamental feature of the universe, fine-tuning, and yet we don't seem to have any convenient way of making a decision between them. The Christians and followers of the Abrahamic tradition would be tempted to say to the multiverse people, we don't need it. We don't need it. Whereas the multiverse people will say to the Christians, speaking of theology, we don't need it. So we have a rather curious standoff. I'll stop at that.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna, and thank you for so beautifully taking account of other things that I said, for example. So, yeah, some questions. Back.
About the beginning of the talk.
Let me come down here
Yeah.
because I'm a little hard of hearing.
about the first verse of the Bible.
Yes.
I don't quite see what supports the translation in the beginning when
No.
God created it.
The way in which that goes is when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It's the next verse that mentions and the waters.
Yeah.
It seems as though the waters are not part of the actual making. I could read that passage again. I know what you mean there, all right, but the way in which exegetes have taken that, Dr. Lucas could talk about that tomorrow. He would know a lot more about it than I do. But the way in which that particular passage has been construed today is one which, let's see if I can get it again here. Sorry. Well, it's when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, a mighty wind blew over the waters. I mean, that's roughly. That's not verbally exact. I think that's pretty close. The point is, there was a wind blowing over the waters. There were the wild. That notion. One reason that makes that a bit plausible is that in the Babylonian accounts of that time, which I didn't talk about, Dr. Lucas will, I'm sure, talk about those. There is at the beginning the wilderness of waters, the storm of the waters. The waters are already there, and so there is at least a suggestion here that there is. And you see, I think the important point here, I think, is this: that for the people of that time, and even for early, well, at least for the very first Christians, it wasn't an important issue. I mean, God made all the interesting stuff. It made animals, made plants, and so on. Did he have any prior materials? Well, you know, that issue becomes crucial when they're challenged by the Gnostics and by other sects at that time. But at the time that the 6th century BC, when the first chapter was apparently written, that wouldn't have been, the Jews of that time would not, I think, have required a clarification. If you had pressed them, I mean, if you went around to a pub in Babylon and said, you know, what about these waters? I mean, they very likely at that point would have said, well, gosh, I never thought of that, but I'm sure God must have made the waters too. The point is, it's not explicit. And what is happening in the process that I try to describe today is a continuing making explicit of something which is in some sense contained right from the beginning. Yeah. But it's not made explicit. It's the process of explicitation, which is true of so much else in theology. The whole history of theology, continuing right up to the present, is one of making explicit, sometimes in very surprising ways. I mean, for example, if today we take Darwinian evolution to be a working out of God's plan, that's a rather unexpected explicitation that would have taken a lot of medievals by surprise, or even a lot of recent Christians for that matter. But anyway, that's my answer.
And I suppose you'd say that some of the New Testament passages are undeveloped too.
Yes.
They seem to indicate the same thing. The prologue to God,
Yes.
God's Gospel. I mean, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah.
All things were made by Him.
Yeah, they're consistent with the notion of ex nihilo. They're consistent with it, but it's not a point that they're making. At least I would argue that it's not. Yeah.
A two-parter. The first is you mentioned the Vulgate, and
Yes.
I would wonder how the Septuagint read actually in Genesis
Septuagint.
1:1. That's the first part.
Ask Dr. Lucas
Okay.
tomorrow. I'm pretty sure, since that's the Greek translation, the crucial thing is the Hebrew text.
And of course, the Septuagint that would give us a strong idea
It
as
would,
to how the
though
Jews.
not necessarily, I mean, one would have to ask, no, one has to go back to the Hebrew text. I mean, the Septuagint doesn't always get the Hebrew text right.
So the Septuagint, and also to look at the Hebrew text as well. So I'll ask Dr. Lucas.
Oh yeah. I mean, insofar as there has been a revision of that text, it's entirely because of the Hebrew. It's not because of the. But as to what the Septuagint would say, I just don't know.
Well, part two is if in Genesis 1:1 there is, as you said, ambiguity
Yes.
as to whether this is a God that truly creates ex nihilo.
Right.
Which means it could be one of two approaches. It seems to me that just examining the other evidence scripturally You have a God that is outside of space and time, that's sovereign over all.
Right.
There's no grandfather God at all.
Right.
God is God. And that the alternative to creation ex nihilo is that matter would have existed alongside God, presumably for eternity. It seems that the no-brainer, if I may say it that way, is that the Bible clearly suggests an ex nihilo creation. I'm not sure why one would come to another conclusion.
But you see, I think the difficulty here is that in the tradition, let's see how to put it, in the period in which the first chapter of Genesis was written, there was a common view. It was, after all, was written possibly in Babylon, or at least shortly after that, and so a common view that we know fairly detailed from the Babylonian epics is that the gods, for them, plural, created from waters which for them meant unformed. There is nothing there yet of any consequence. There's no plants, there's no animals, there's no earth, there's no sun. So waters for them would not have had much significance. It wouldn't have seemed like an important issue. But you see, it becomes an important issue when you take waters to be over against God and to be a resistant feature responsible for evil. I mean, that's the problem that the Christians face. They had to come clean on that. They had to say, no water. God is responsible for all, and God is responsible. And that is why, really draws that out very much. And Augustine is very well aware, very uncomfortably aware, huge problems that the others didn't have. At least he is one of them they didn't have. One is the problem of free will. So taking on, making God the creator ex nihilo, involves theodicy in a very big way, as we all know today. The echoes of that are still with us. So, in that sense, then, I think that the people of the Old Testament days simply were not involved in that issue. At least it seems like they were not yet alerted to the issue that unless they are explicit as to whether God is the God who had no material, did not require a material to work with, that unless you make that explicit, you're open to the possibility that there is something over against God that somehow is a God-like, has existed from all eternity.
So, if I may just follow up, it does seem, though, that still whether or not God actually created everything ex nihilo, that let's say that in the alternative explanation, God is simply, God did not create ex nihilo, but still God is depicted in Job 38, for example, and other places, as still certainly wielding all of these cosmic elements. So, in other words, it doesn't really get God off the hook either way.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right.
There's a question there, yes.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for an exposition of 3,000 years of thinking about creation. It's quite something. And I'd like to come right to the front end, to now. First, a rather trivial thing. You said that the theological explanation had the advantage of having a doctrine already in place. I wondered whether actually that isn't an advantage for many modern thinkers who would like to be able to say they start afresh or to start with new, but that's a small thing. But you then went on to say that we have no criteria to judge between when it's a theological, when the theological or scientific, no accepted criteria to judge between theological and scientific explanation. And I wonder whether there is no possibility of having such criteria, because in a way that's part of where our free will for judgment comes in.
Yes. No, I think that suggestion is probably quite right. Frankly, I don't see the likelihood of a super criterion here. The point is that from the point of view of the scientist, it partly depends on one's view of science, of course. But if one is a metaphysical naturalist, we heard much about that earlier, that is, if you hold that the only legitimate form of rationality is within science, the only legitimate form of proof, of justification, of confirmation is within science, then of course it excludes the theological. Right from the beginning, it's not a matter to discuss. Now, there are more sophisticated, many more sophisticated approaches. A well-known American philosopher of science, Adolf Grünbaum, who has carried on a campaign for 30 years on this. He has an elaborate set of arguments against the idea of there being any rational, not just scientific, but any rational reason to believe in a creator God. He gives a whole series. I didn't discuss that, but I mean, the point that he's arguing is, well, sure, this issue of fine-tuning and so on, the theological response to it requires a creator God, and that issue is not a scientific one. But his answer is not to say, therefore it's wrong. He's going to say, well, what kind of an argument is it? Is it a metaphysical one? Do you have a metaphysical argument for the existence of God? And he takes on those arguments in detail. And without going into them, let me just summarize one of them, the one that he pushes most, which is this. And it's one that Augustine would be interested in. What he says is that those who argue metaphysically that existence requires an explanation, that a contingent existence requires there to be an explanation, that the cosmos, if it exists, requires an explanation. He said that is to privilege the state of existence as requiring explanation, whereas nothing, the existence of nothing, is equally natural. They're both equally natural, so to speak. That existence has no privilege in terms of explanation over the alternative of there not being anything, at least nothing contingent. So that he has developed a whole series of arguments. So that's one possible. So he thinks that he's taken care of this by undermining the only prop that he will allow. He will not allow the scriptural prop. He's strongly critical of that, in fact. He grew up, I should tell you this if you ever want to read Grünbaum, I should explain something about him. He grew up as a boy in Cologne at the time of the Nazis. His family suffered greatly. He suffered many losses in the Holocaust, and he has not forgotten that. So the Christian alternative doesn't appeal to him.
Well, presumably his own Jewish alternative would be similar, but he doesn't.
Yes.
He's rejected that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, no, yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, and just on the you gave a fantastic overview at the end of 5 explanations, let's say 5 pillars.
4.
Oh, well, with another. Oh, yeah, 4. Okay.
I left out. There was one that. Well, there is one that is so crazy that I didn't want to bring it.
But first of all, one point of agreement between science and religion, of exact agreement that struck me immediately, was, of course, the first one. Scientists and theologians dislike the chance explanation for the exactly the same reasons. Yeah.
They tend to agree on that. Yeah.
But of course, a psychologist there, and they rarely make, but a psychologist
Right.
might say, well, maybe that's evidence of the human dislike of chance, that we just don't like the idea that it might be. But I think, for me, one avenue that's definitely worth exploring is the combination of 1 and 2, the combination of, chance is one thing when you're talking about a huge number of independent constants all being exactly right. But of course, when you combine that with your second possibility, which is that many of those fine-tuning constants turn out, especially from a theory which we don't have now, but in the future, not to be independent, then chance of something suddenly becomes a lot more, let's say, reasonable if the number of coincidences is actually very small, doesn't it? And where I wanted to ask you about is, let's look at a specific example of that, because we talked about inflation as one, but a much better example was the one, Salam's name came up yesterday. And of course with Salam, that never gets enough attention, where originally, instead of talking about lots and lots of particles, you have this thing in the 70s where two fundamental forces of four turn out to be facets of one force. And there's no question about that now in terms of experimental evidence. Not only do they turn out to be closely related, or in fact they're the same thing, but that in turn leads to predictions of particles that have to have certain masses and no others, etc., etc. And of course the whole particle scheme then, I mean, it has that terrible name theory of everything, but what it's really about is that all four of those may very well have been one interaction. Now, is it not true that if that's true, and although that means all the masses of the particles and all that really come down to one or two constants of symmetry?
Well, that's a technical question for the physicists, of course, but what makes that, at least at the moment, seem quite implausible, I think, but not to be excluded. I mean, you can't. Relativity theory and quantum theory were such a shocking surprise, particularly quantum theory, which John Polkinghorne mentioned yesterday. It undermined many intuitions. Entanglement runs against 2,000 years of what seemed to be dogma and metaphysics. So, I mean, one can't be too dogmatic about this, but the people like Weinberg, for example, who have looked at that, Weinberg in particular, does not think that the multiplicity of these is in fact at all likely to be reduced by a single simple theory, as he would say it. Now, even if you take the standard model at the moment, it does not explain of itself why in fact the forces do have the ratios that they do. I mean, it just doesn't explain that. It takes them for granted and takes off from that. Now, the question would be whether there could be a theory that would not only unite relativity theory and quantum theory, but would in fact specify, I mean, incredibly detailed. I mean, the quantities are so diverse and so precise, it just seems, well, one can't exclude it, of course, but I must say I've been persuaded that at the moment as it stands, it doesn't seem very likely. But I do want to emphasize that it has to be kept in mind. In that sense, you're right.
Thank you. Well, now it is 12:30 and lunch is ordered early, isn't it? We want to give Ernan a very big thank you, of course.
Thank you.